Right now, Russia is preparing a direct strike on Poland and is already building secret launch sites to deploy jet drones across Eastern Europe. The Polish Deputy Minister of National Defense, Cezary Tomczyk, made a statement which can hardly be described as anything other than alarming. Here is his quote: "We are preparing for war with Russia, hoping that it will never start." And he immediately added specifics. A large-scale provocation from the Kremlin could very well happen within the next few months. And there is a very specific explanation for this, because today the Telegraph revealed exactly why such vigilance is needed in Eastern Europe. Russia has built at least 10 bases for launching long-range kamikaze drones right on NATO's borders, and some of these bases can easily reach Warsaw. But at the same time, Putin himself is facing a ton of problems right now. In particular, Russia's grain exports are almost completely paralyzed, and the armed forces of Ukraine are methodically stopping the Russian offensive on several fronts at once. So let's calmly break down the whole picture in this episode and put everything in its place. My name is Alexei Peci. Let's get started. But before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like and leave any comment under this video. So, let's start with the Polish warning about war itself. According to the Deputy Minister of National Defense of Poland, Cezary Tomczyk, the Polish authorities and the army are already working out response plans for the worst-case scenario. This is a direct war with Russia, a telling detail which he himself emphasized. The Polish authorities no longer divide scenarios into real and unreal, but only into likely and unlikely. Next is his quote: "Today, I wouldn't set a final deadline anymore. A large-scale provocation from the Kremlin could very well happen within the next few months." At the same time, Tomczyk believes that Russia is not yet ready for a full-scale war with NATO, but that doesn't mean it will never happen. He also urged the allies to realistically assess their own strength. Quote, "We see that Ukraine has held Russia back, not to mention the full potential of the alliance. We need to stop, realize our true strength." So in Poland, they are calling to prepare not for a hypothetical, but for a very real war. Like, it's better to be ready and the war never happens than for a war to start and everyone is unprepared. As a result, we see a situation where Europe is forced to respond to any escalation from Russia. And for Russia, any NATO military activity gives them a reason to tell their people that NATO is preparing to attack them. But it's important not to forget that NATO is a defensive alliance, and even if they really wanted to strike first, their bureaucratic system would only allow it after years. For now, the entire strategy is built around defense and response. Let me remind you that Russia's war against Ukraine has been going on for more than 12 years. All this time, Russia has carried out multiple cyberattacks on European countries, and only now has Germany started considering the possibility of not just responding, but launching a preemptive cyber attack on Moscow. And even today, after 12 years, this idea still faces resistance, not to mention actual military action. Now, here's what the Telegraph specifically uncovered and what made Europeans nervous. Russia has set up 10 bases in the Russian border regions and in the occupied Ukrainian territories for the mass launch of long-range kamikaze drones, including the jet-powered Geran 5 drone, whose range covers not only all of Ukraine, but also the countries of NATO's eastern flank. And now the Telegraph names specific sites. These are the Shatalovo airfield in the Smolensk region, the Cymbulovo site, the Navlia base, and the Osowitsa site in the Bryansk region. Donetsk Airport, the Primorsko-Akhtarsk base in the Krasnodar region, and the Kacha airfield and Cape Chowda in the occupied Crimea. At these sites, at least 59 launch rails for fixed-wing drones have been deployed. Plus, there are warehouses for storing 1,000 such devices, and at several key points, additional launchers are currently being built. And now the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer of DroneSec, specializing in the analysis of drone-related threats, Mike Monnik, stated, "The Kremlin has significantly expanded its drone network in an effort to attack Ukraine and keep a NATO member state under the threat of similar strikes." And according to DroneSec's analysis, about 20 recently assembled launchers have increased length. This indicates the capability to launch long-range strike UAVs, which can reach not only Warsaw, but also Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Turkey, the Baltics and Finland. And the official NATO representative told the publication that the alliance is ready to defend every inch of Allied territory and will continue to increase its readiness to deter threats, including drones. At the same time, the Telegraph notes that representatives of European and American intelligence services have repeatedly warned in the past about the renewed possibility of an armed provocation by Moscow on Polish territory, missile or drone attacks on critical infrastructure facilities in the Baltic region, as well as false flag provocations using fake Ukrainian drones. Well, in other words, exactly the scheme, the risks of which we have already discussed in previous episodes. There is also a specific time frame which raises even more concerns among Europeans. According to the New York Times citing sources, Vladimir Putin expects to gain at least full control over Donbass by the fall of 2027. If the Russians fail to achieve this by that deadline, the likelihood of negotiations will increase, and key decisions on this matter must be made in advance. And so, the New York Times also cites the expectations of Western officials and analysts. Russia will escalate the war in the winter, targeting Ukraine's civilian infrastructure and civilians. And here there's a direct connection with the Polish warning. And some fear that Vladimir Putin, feeling cornered, might try to escalate the war and test NATO's solidarity, going beyond hybrid attacks in Europe. At the same time, European allies like Britain and Russia, France and Germany are trying to secure their own involvement in future negotiations, unwilling to rely entirely on the unpredictable administration of Donald Trump. But the point is that Putin, in his latest push to seize Donbass, might strike Europe in order to sharply reduce the supply of weapons to Ukraine. The idea is that a new war would break out there, and Europe would be preoccupied with it while Putin tries to fully capture Donbass. And now the second half of today's topic. And here the picture is much less favorable for the Kremlin itself, which leads us to think that many of Putin's threats may remain just scare tactics. Because there are plenty of problems within Russia itself. Firstly, Russia has already experienced a second wave of the fuel crisis, which they seem to have partially resolved. They started producing extremely low-quality gasoline, but even that isn't enough. So they began importing from India, and that's still not enough, which led to the second wave. But let me tell you about another episode. Russian grain exports, which bring about $15 billion in foreign currency revenue to the Russian economy every year, have been almost completely paralyzed due to Ukrainian strikes on the ports of the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. Last week, after drone attacks, all 3 grain terminals at the port of Novorossiysk stopped operating. Through these terminals, about 25 million tons of grain were exported. At the end of July, the terminal in Taman was shut down, and a few weeks earlier, the authorities suspended shipping through the Kerch Strait. As a result, the ports of the Sea of Azov were blocked. Through these ports, Russia exported about 40% of its grain. And now, almost all Russian grain exports through the Azov Black Sea basin have come to a halt. Only one port remains operational, and that's the port of Tuapse. It's the smallest of the deep water ports. Just to give you a sense of scale, last season, the ports of the Azov Black Sea basin accounted for 88% of all Russian grain shipments by sea, or more than 46 million tons. And now, everything has stopped. You know, I rarely quote Russian experts, but today is an exception. The president of the Russian Grain Union, Arkady Zlochevsky, said today that a good harvest in 2026, which is almost 140 million tons, there's simply no one to sell it to. Here is his quote. "The granaries are being filled every day, but demand has stopped. Exporters have practically stopped buying our grain. Domestic grain prices are collapsing. 12,000 rubles per ton of fourth-class wheat compared to 15,000 last year. This is a catastrophic level. Huge losses." And at the end, he gives a grim forecast. Many farmers in the Russian Federation simply won't survive this season. Now about the situation at the front. According to the latest report from the Institute for the Study of War, Russian troops continued offensive operations in the north of Sumy region on August 15 and 16, but did not achieve any confirmed progress. The enemy is using small infantry groups of 1 to 3 soldiers to infiltrate between Ukraine positions, ignoring constant losses, and even though the grass is over 2 meters high, their movement has been stopped. Russian units also tried to break through in the north, and they tried to present it as a capture. To be continued. But analysts from the Institute for the Study of War have exposed this as fake. There is fighting in the settlement, and the enemy has not yet established strongholds there. In the Kupiansk direction, Russian troops also continued attacks on August 15 and 16, but did not advance. The Ukrainian defense forces are holding positions on the southern outskirts of Kupiansk itself, the very same one that, let me remind you, the Russians already captured completely a couple of times last year, and even Putin announced it. In the Sloviansk direction, the enemy also tried to break through but failed, and Ukrainian soldiers recently cleared the area in the western part of Konstantinivka of Russian scum. Sorry, I meant Russian scouts. In summary, Russia is indeed preparing infrastructure for a potential strike against NATO countries. But at the same time, that very Putin, who is supposedly capable of such escalation, is right now losing huge amounts of money because of Ukrainian strikes on Russia. And he is facing a frozen front line, where even small infantry groups cannot advance without taking noticeable losses. And he is running up against his own deadline of Autumn 2027, which he set for himself for the capture of Donbass. So for now, it doesn't look like Putin can handle another full-scale front. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye everyone.